Software to merge multiple image captures into panoramas has been around for a long time now, and there are many software options, some of which are free. In most scenarios, like the one I'm showing here, blend together seamlessly and automatically, even in free software, without any issues. In this video, I'm going to show you how to deal with two common situations that cause panoramas to fail and what to do about it. And if you stay around till the end, I have some bonus tips on how to photograph panoramas to avoid these post-processing hurdles. I've been photographing panoramas for a long time now using a lot of different equipment, starting back in the film days, and a lot of different software. It's enabled me to print murals 30 meters and longer and 2.5 meters high with incredible detail and sharpness. So I'm a big fan of panoramas. And today I wanted to show you 3 different levels of software you could use to process panoramas. So one's completely free, one's a subscription model at a reasonable price, and one's a dedicated panoramic software which is really for heavy-duty processing of panoramas. I want to start with the most straightforward of the stitched images because all 3 softwares easily cope with this single row panorama, which is 20 individual exposures of quite a wide view. So I'm going to start in Lightroom because Lightroom's the software I use most often. It manages my photo library, so it's more efficient for me to stay in Lightroom if I can for all of my processing. So I'm in the library mode. I right click on one of the images, go down to Photo Merge Panorama, select cylindrical for the projection method because it's a single row panorama, that's correct. And I prefer to use fill edges for filling in those gaps around the edges. Works very well for this sort of scenario. Click Merge. And after about 45 seconds, Lightroom has finished the merged panorama. So I'm going to go to Develop module because you'll notice this image is quite dark. I've purposefully underexposed it overall to be sure that I could get the detail in the very bright sunrise area. So I just want to brighten up this image overall. We'll do a few quick adjustments. I would add a linear gradient to the sky, a mask layer, and just drop that exposure a bit. Probably add a oval gradient around the central area just to brighten that area up. Maybe add a bit of warmth in there, a bit of clarity. You sort of get the general idea, I think. So the advantage of keeping this in Lightroom is I've started with original raw files which give me a lot of ability to process an image, and the panorama that Lightroom produces is still a raw file, a raw DNG file, so it gives me incredible range for post-processing of the image. So let's do the same panorama in Canva Affinity. So I go to the Affinity File menu, down to New Image Process, Panorama. It brings up this dialog box, which I find a bit frustratingly small because you can't resize it, but you need to add the images you're going to merge together to this box. Once you've done that, hit the Stitch Panorama button. It'll take a few moments and you'll get a preview of the rendered panorama. Click OK. Takes a few moments to render the panorama. Once that's done, you do have a bit of control where you can actually select individual segments of the panorama and move them around if they don't align. But I'm going to just apply this because it's done a pretty good job of rendering it. Once that's applied, hit the pixel layout. And from here, you can fill in the edges around the canvas by going down to the infill brush and just brushing along the edge where you need to fill in the blank areas. And there's the stitched panorama, much the same as what we process in Lightroom. I would need to go in and adjust things like curves and perhaps do a a localized adjustment on the sky, much the same as I did in Lightroom. The only disadvantage of Affinity is that you're not working with a raw image anymore, so you don't have the same depth of adjustment, but it's pretty good. You get a lot of room for movement. So the last of the software to do this straightforward panorama is PTGui, and it's a standalone panorama software. It's my go-to if I'm struggling to join together a really difficult panorama because it has lots and lots of manual control. There's way too much in it to go into in this tutorial, but let me know in the comments if you want to see a dedicated tutorial on PTGui. So once again, I load the images into the software. Click on Align Images and it does an auto align, and straight off it's done a pretty good job. But if I wanted to go in and adjust manual control, I have a lot of adjustments I can adjust. And one interesting one is control points. I can look at two of the images that go side by side and check that the control points are in the right places, or even add more control points just so that the images have a lot of reference points to line up. So of course PTGui has no trouble with this fairly straightforward panorama. So on to the first of the challenging images, and this is where there's been some subject motion or movement in between the frames, so they don't line up properly. And in Lightroom, I select all the images as before, right click on one of them, go down to Photo Merge Panorama, and single row, so I select cylindrical, and it stitches them together okay, but you can see these obvious joins where the waves have moved so the surf doesn't really line up. I'm going to show a bit later on how to correct this in Photoshop, which is Lightroom's companion program. So on to Affinity. Once again, I need to go to New Panorama, select the images I want to join together, click on Stitch Panorama, and it does a reasonable job of aligning the images. However, you've got these obvious join areas again. So in Affinity, you do have these additional tools that you can adjust things with, particularly this add to mask or subtract from mask. However, in practice, I find it's a little bit less intuitive than Photoshop, but you could manually adjust where these masks join the images together using Affinity. So here in PTGui, I've loaded the 6 images to stitch together into the window, and it's done a good job of lining up and merging the images, but once again we've got these obvious joins. Now in PTGui there is a masking section which allows me to mask out particular areas of an image so that it uses the image it's joining onto. However, it's not as sophisticated as Photoshop or Affinity for this sort of work, because I can't soften the edge of the brush and I can't alter the transparency of the brush. So this is one area where PTGui is a little bit lacking, and I would do a fix of a job like this in Photoshop or even in Affinity, which you can soften the edge of brushes and you can work in layers. Now onto the second challenging image, the image with a lot of blank sky in it. I'm going to quickly work through these images without talking through them much, because you've seen the rough capabilities of the 3 software, and we'll just have a look at the results of each of the 3 softwares. So starting off with Lightroom. So Affinity is definitely a fail, and I don't see any way of altering the panoramic merging mode, which might have given me a different result. So although PTGui did register that a few control points were missing, it's done a pretty good job straight out of the automatic process, joining all of the images together and lining them up really well. So I could fine-tune this find out where images aren't quite overlapping, but actually if I rendered out this panorama, it looks pretty good, and it will also render as a raw file, a DNG file, which I can re-import back into Lightroom and adjust like any other raw file, giving me incredible range of adjustment. So what I want to show now is how to fix an image like this in Photoshop, or you could actually do this in Affinity using layers and layer masks, because it's failed in effectively all of the softwares, but we haven't tried layers in Photoshop. So I need to select all of the individual components, the 6 separate images, right click on one of them, go to Merge to Panorama in Photoshop, and that hands off the images over to Photoshop. And I can just leave that on auto. I want to take off blend images together because I want to leave the images as separate layers. But I am going to leave on vignette removal and geometric distortion because I want the images to distort so that they line up correctly underneath each other. Click OK. Photoshop puts the separate images into a layer stack and then attempts to align the images and apply any necessary distortion so that the images line up. So one of the images hasn't lined up. I could manually move this round, move it to the top of the layer stack and line it up manually. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to delete it from the stack and crop the image down, and we'll just work with the images that have lined up correctly. Also, I'm not going to go in depth to the process of adding layers and layer masks in Photoshop. That's really the topic for a separate tutorial. So let me know in the comments if you'd like one specifically on this very powerful feature in Photoshop. So here's my layer stack, one image on top of the other and all lined up perfectly. So that to start this, I need to add a layer mask to the top image, select a brush, and I'm using the interactive brush control to adjust the opacity, the hardness, and the diameter of the brush, and actually using number keys to adjust the opacity. So 0 takes it to 100%, 5, 50%, 2, 20%, and so on. So I've got this layer mask here on the top layer. I'm going to paint with black, which removes part of that layer. And I'm just blending the top layer into the one below it. And I just carry on through the layer stack, adding layer masks as I go, and just painting out part of the top layer until one layer blends invisibly into the one below it. The good thing about layers and layer masks is that you can go backwards and forwards and tweak it until you're happy with what you've got. Just brushing with a little bit of transparency here so that I get a much more convincing blend. This is also working non-destructively in that I can save this file and come back and adjust these layer masks at any time if I save this file with all its layers. So there we have a pretty reasonable blending of the various layers. The next thing I need to address is the crooked horizon, but to do that I actually need to blend all of these layers together. Now I could just merge all of these layers together, but the way I prefer to do that is to select all the layers and convert them into a smart object. A smart object layer just lets me work non-destructively, and this will become clear as I go on. So now that's become a smart object layer. I can drag down a guide around the horizon line just so I can have something to line up the horizon with. And one way I can adjust the horizon line is to use a tool called Puppet Warp, which I can find in the Edit menu. And this works by adding points in the image that I want to either move around or stay stable. So I'm just adding points on the edges here because I don't want to move these just yet. And then what I can do is click on a point and drag it. And that way, just warping the horizon until it lines up with the straight edge. And I can click and add points when I need to as well. I can also add points to the edges and corners of the image and drag them out. And work my way around the image, correcting it like this. Now I press Enter to activate those pins. And that's done a not too bad job. Now if I save this image and close it, we'll find that it's actually updated in Lightroom. So there it is there. I have a preview of the image, but of course I can't access any of the layers or the pins. To do that, I need to right-click and go back to Photoshop, Edit in Photoshop, Edit Original. And because I saved this image, these layers as a Smart Object layer, I can actually go back into the Puppet Warp and still tweak any of these points or add more points. So very non-destructive method of editing. But let's say I want to try a different method of warping this image because I'm not very happy with how this is working. So I can just go to the Smart Object layer, delete the Puppet Warp, and instead I'm going to use a Transform tool, which Command T or Control T. Right click on that once it's activated and go down to Warp. And in a similar fashion, I can just push the image around by clicking on the image where I want to warp it. And for this image, this is probably a cleaner way of tidying up this image and getting a straight horizon. And I can distort all those corners so you can't really see them. Once I'm happy with that, I click Enter, and that activates the Transform tool. Save the image, go back to Lightroom, and there's the image updated. So Lightroom and Photoshop work really well together for these difficult scenarios. Interestingly, I could do all of what I showed you using the free version of Affinity as well. It's just a different way of working and not quite as seamless, but for those of you on a budget who would like to do really difficult panoramas in a sophisticated way, Affinity is a really good option. So now for some bonus tips. If you're photographing a panorama where there's a lot of subject movement, and this could be people moving through a scene, it could be foliage blowing around in the wind, or even waves crashing on a beach. You need to photograph each segment of the panorama quite rapidly so there's as little movement as possible between each frame. And the way to do this is I would have it on a tripod on a level base, so you're not worried about keeping the panorama level, and just be very fast in between the frames. And if you can afford a high enough shutter speed, you can even go into a motor drive mode and just hold your finger on the button and spin it round. And if you're photographing a scene that's got a lot of blank, textureless detail, typically this would be bright blue sky without any clouds, allow for more overlap between the images. So normally I would do about 30 to 35%, but For a sky that's got hardly any texture, I might do 70% overlap, so just moving a little bit every time and getting plenty of overlap gives you a much better chance of a stitch. If you think you'll struggle to get a stitch even using that method, as a backup you can use your phone. Because a phone takes a panorama continuously as it's photographing, you don't have the same problem with those skies. So you can take a backup with your phone. Of course you won't get the resolution, but sometimes it's better than nothing. So to finish off, here's a few of my favourite panoramas from the years. Let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions or any questions. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.